So let's go ahead and look at Fred Bassett's fascinating video of feeding wintering hummingbirds.
And this is part 2 of the Fred Bassett Hummingbird series. We're watching that video. Following that, we'll have a presentation from our own Bubba Scales. We'll show his video on how to use eBird to study the traffic of hummingbirds in winter in Alachua County. And then after that, he will field questions. If you have any questions, post those to the chat, and then I will ask them to Bubba after his presentation. As usual, try to stay muted. It's a distraction, obviously, if there's a lot of noise coming in. And on that note, get started. Theoretically.
Let's switch over and talk about wintering hummingbirds here in the southeast. And that's a real picture with a real hummingbird sitting on a feeder. So as I tell people, unless your yard looks like that, don't call me telling me your hummingbird is cold, because they're not going to be bothered by that. Now, to a lot of people, winter hummingbird is a new phenomenon. In 30 years ago, there weren't any winter hummingbirds because we were all told to take our feeders down by about the 1st of October, and certainly nobody wanted to harm hummingbirds, so we took our feeders down. And if somebody did happen to see a hummingbird in the wintertime and tried to tell Audubon or Fish and Game or something like that that they had a hummingbird, they were told, I know you thought you saw a hummingbird, but we don't have hummingbirds in the wintertime. That was a moth. And so there were no hummingbirds. Well, a lady named Nancy Newfield in the New Orleans area started seeing that wasn't right. And she started giving talks and getting people to leave feeders out. And amazingly enough, winter hummingbirds started showing up there. She taught a guy named Bob Sargent, who started banding all over the southeastern United States. And everywhere that Bob started giving talks, that winter hummingbirds started showing up. Now, what we have found out is that almost all the western species of hummingbirds, a few individuals, rather than migrating into the tropics for the winter, migrate here to the southeast, and they spend the winter here. And they're not poor, lost vagrants like people used to say. Some of them come back to homes year after year. I've had 2 female ruby-throated hummingbirds that came back to the same home for 9 years in a row. So they know exactly where they're going and what they're doing. I'm going to ask that you leave a feeder out in the wintertime. If you have a hummingbird come into your feeder between the 15th of November and the 1st of March, either me or one of the banders associated with me will try to come to your home at no cost to you and identify what kind of hummingbird you have and band it. And you may see that bird for years and years. And if you do, they become real family members. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of slides here about what kind of birds we have. In Alabama, during the wintertime, we have banded 13 different kinds of hummingbirds. Some of those in large numbers, and some of them only one. But you can see a lot of different things can show up here. And I'm not trying to tell you that if you put a feeder up, you're going to get a winter hummingbird, because the probability is not very high. But I'll guarantee you won't get one if you don't leave a feeder up. Now, I convince people to leave a feeder up after the ruby throats leave quite often. And then I will get a call from them about Thanksgiving that said, well, they didn't get one, and they take their feeder down. Well, that's absolutely the wrong time to take your feeder down, because quite often there's some dead time from after the ruby throats leave until the winter hummingbirds start to show up. This is a slide of a 10-year study I did of winter hummingbirds in the southeast, and you can see here that 80% of the winter hummingbirds here are actually in December and January. So if you're going to leave a feeder up in the wintertime, please leave it up all winter long. December and January is when you're going to get your bird. Now, what kind of bird might you get? The most common western hummingbird we have here is a Rufus Hummingbird. This is an adult male, and it's the easiest to spot of all the western hummingbirds because the adult male is this reddish brown color called Rufus with an orange throat or gorget. Beautiful, beautiful creatures. This is the gorget for one of them here. This is a female Rufus hummingbird. Now, if you see this bird from the back, it's green, so it looks a lot like a ruby-throated hummingbird. But quite often, she will have a brown spot in the center of the throat. This is one of the few birds that the females get central gorget feathers, but they're very small feathers, and the color is quite often hard to see. Now, here's an adult female. You can see the spot in her throat here. This is an interesting bird because a photographer in southeastern Oklahoma took a picture of this bird, and she realized it wasn't a ruby-throated hummingbird, and then she realized it was wearing a band on its leg. And she was a pretty good photographer because she was able to get P06109, which was the number on that band. Now, she probably took 150 pictures to get those two with that, but she was able to get the band number, and she contacted me. Actually, she contacted the National Bird Banding Laboratory, and they told them it was my band. She called me, and I told her that the bird was banded the previous winter in Montgomery, Alabama. It was on the way back home to Montgomery. 2 weeks later, it showed back up at the lady's home in Montgomery and came back for 5 more winters there. So both of those ladies were very happy about that. This is an immature male Rufus hummingbird. You can tell that by gorget feather off the center here, Rufus color down there, and a lot more color in the tail, but still has white tail feathers. The thing that might help you recognize the Rufus hummingbird quite often is the Rufus color here on the interior part of the tail. Shows up better here in this slide. This is a bird that came back to home in Auburn for 2 years, a few years ago. This is the most famous hummingbird in the world. This is a immature female Rufus hummingbird that Fred Dietrich, who bands for me in Tallahassee, Florida, banded in January at a home in Tallahassee, Florida. 5 months later, that bird was caught by another bander that I trained in Alaska. This bird was found 3,600 miles from where it was originally banded. So it's the longest distance migrant in the world. The second longest migrant is this bird that we call Miss Canada. It was banded in British Columbia, about 50 miles west of Banff. Then I caught it in Foley, Alabama, on Alabama's Gulf Coast the next 2 winters. The second most common winter hummingbird we have here is a black-chinned hummingbird. And if you see this bird from any other angle than straight on, it looks a lot like a ruby-throated hummingbird. They're like double first cousins, very difficult to tell apart. If you are lucky enough to get the gorget just right, you'll see the top half of his gorget is black and the bottom half is this beautiful purple color. But that's much, much harder to see than the red in the throat of a ruby-throated hummingbird, hence the name black-chinned hummingbirds. This is an immature male, just starting to get his gorget feathers there. This is one that I banded in Montgomery, Alabama in January of this year. This is a female black-chinned hummingbird, and they're almost impossible to tell from a female ruby-throated hummingbird. You might possibly tell by a little bit of behavior, but quite often I have to get the bird in my hand before I can really distinguish between them. This happens to be a female black-chinned hummingbird that I caught this past summer in Idaho, and this bird was over 12 years old when I caught it. I banded that bird in June of 2008 in that same yard. I caught it again in July of 2019, so that bird was at least 12 years old. It's the second oldest hummingbird ever documented. This little fellow is the smallest hummingbird in North America. This is a Calliope Hummingbird. And his gorget feathers, rather than filled in completely, have these kind of longish, reddish purple feathers. And he can do something magic with those. Check that out. Now, to set this up for you, in the foreground is a female Calliope Hummingbird. And this guy is got his gorget feathers completely displayed out to 90 degrees. As I tell people, he's working for it to show her that he's the most beautiful thing she's ever seen in her life. And this is what one looks like in hand. up in the mountains in Idaho. They quite often do that in my hand, but they don't really scare me that much. Now, here's one actually in a person's hand. And what's important about this is, remember back when the slides had dates on them? The date on this is the 20th of January, 1998. And the reason that's important is because the day before that, on the 19th of January, Bob Sargent gave a talk in Anniston, Alabama about winter hummingbirds. And nobody knew about winter hummingbirds back then. But one gentleman listened to him, went home that afternoon, drug a feeder out, put sugar water in it, and the next morning at 7 o'clock, he called Bob Sargent that he had this adult male Calliope Hummingbird. It was the first adult male in Alabama. What that proves is that bird was already in his yard. It didn't show up just because he put a feeder up that afternoon. Several years ago, there was a big article about me and winter hummingbird banding in the Mobile Press Register. There were 3 ladies there that had never heard of winter hummingbird before, put feeders up, and the next day they had a hummingbird in their yard. What I'm telling you is, unless you have a feeder up, you're probably not going to see a hummingbird. You may not see one, but I guarantee you won't see one if you don't have a feeder up. This is an immature male in Tallahassee. The females are just generic birds. Very, very difficult to tell. Although they're much smaller, and quite often reported to me as baby hummingbirds until I get there. With the females of almost all of these species, they are very, very hard to distinguish. So I tell people, it's not your job to tell them apart. If you have a hummingbird in the wintertime, I'll be glad to come to your house and identify it and band it for you. Now we're getting into some more exotic birds here now. This is a buff-bellied hummingbird, and this is a bird that actually migrates backwards. They breed down in the very southern tip of Texas and down into Mexico, and in the wintertime, they come up along the Gulf Coast in winter, normally fairly close to the coast, but I have banded them as far north as Prattville, Alabama. Big birds with a red bill. Both the males and the females have green throats, a buff belly, and chestnut-colored tail feathers. Beautiful, beautiful birds. Here's the one in hand, and the emerald gorge is just unbelievable. It's like having emerald fire in your hand. This is an Allen's hummingbird, which is a double first cousin with a Rufus hummingbird. They're almost impossible to tell apart, but some people want to know all the possibilities of birds they might get. If it's an adult male, you can tell it's a Allen's and not a Rufus because it's got a green back rather than a Rufus-colored back. But if it's not that, then you got to get the bird in your hand to positively identify it. This is a young male I banded this winter in Foley, Alabama. Now this is the same bird, only 2 weeks later. He's completed his molt into an adult. You see he's got a full gorget now. And you can see the green back here. It's a beautiful picture there. Here's a female Allen's hummingbird. You can't tell her. What's important with this is look at her wings. The way her wings are bent, that she's treading air. Like we tread water in the pool. She moves her wings in a figure-8 motion back and forth, changing them, and as fast as 50 times a second. And she develops lift in both the fore and the aft stroke. And that's why hummingbirds are the only birds in the world that can truly hover. They can stay in one spot as long as they want to. They can go up, down, left, right, and they can even fly upside down for short periods of time. And it's because their wings are hinged differently and how fast they can beat them. Now this is the Rocky Mountain equivalent of our ruby-throated hummingbird. This is a broad-tailed hummingbird. Some people have great difficulty telling them apart, but one of the tricks is that above the red in a ruby-throated hummingbird, there's black between that and his face. But on a broadtail, it's just white there. You won't see that. But here's one in flight. You can see that. And we've only had one adult male that spent the winter here a few years ago in Tallahassee, Florida. More common are immatures or females. This is one that came back for 2 years at a home in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. And I always tell people I think this bird could read because it was staying at a house on Hummingbird Lane in Fort Walton Beach. This is a broad-billed hummingbird, a Mexican hummingbird you wouldn't normally expect to find here. I used to actually have this picture on my wall back home. And then about 10 years ago, this bird showed up in Mobile, Alabama. the first one in the east. And since then, we've banded 5 in Alabama. This is Florida's first one in Blountstown, Florida. We've banded 5 in Florida and 2 in Georgia. So we've banded 12 of those. But the most famous of those is this female that I banded a few years ago in November at a home in the Spanish Fort, Alabama, on a bluff overlooking Mobile Bay. That bird stayed all winter long and was still there the next April. The lady who was a good friend of mine decided if it was there in April, it must be nesting in her yard, and she was going to go out and find the nest. Well, it's almost impossible to find a ruby-throated hummingbird nest, but within about 15 minutes, she found this nest. And the deal is, western hummingbirds nest much more in the open. This bird had built a nest at the end of a dead stick hanging out from the foliage of an oak tree. But just a few days after she found the nest, the bird abandoned the nest, and we took it down to find out that the eggs were sterile and did not hatch. But this is the only hummingbird ever documented trying to nest in the eastern United States. This is an Anna's hummingbird, a hummingbird that's rapidly expanding through the Pacific Northwest, and we get a few of them here in the wintertime. And when they start to get a gorget, it's kind of like a ruby throat there, but then all of a sudden something happens and it goes all the way across the top of their head. Isn't that a beautiful bird? It's called a helmet when it goes over its head like that. Now, the only adult male we ever had close to us here, this was one a few years ago in Huntsville, Alabama. More common are females. This is a picture of an immature male. You can see getting rose-colored feathers is also getting them on the top of its head. This is not a very nice, good picture here, but there's a reason for that. I took the picture in the dark. This is the first Costas hummingbird ever seen in the eastern United States. I got a call from a lady in Montgomery, Alabama on New Year's Eve that she had a hummingbird at her house. It looked like it had some purple in its throat. And I thought it was going to be an immature male black-chinned hummingbird, which is a nice bird. But I went to her house real early on New Year's morning. I pulled the bird out of the trap. I saw the purple in his throat and I was happy, but then I saw the purple on top of his head. And it was the first Costas hummingbird ever seen in the eastern United States. It stayed all winter, and this is what it looked like in April when it left. Beautiful, beautiful bird with purple gorge and a purple helmet there. Now, I jokingly tell people that Fred Dietrich, that works in Tallahassee, Florida, got so jealous that about 3 years later, he called me one morning telling me that he thought he'd caught a Costas hummingbird. Well, by then, rather than regular old cameras, we had iPhones. So within about 30 seconds, he sent me this picture. It's very obviously, this is an immature male Costas hummingbird. Now, the deal with this is the first Costas hummingbird was banded within 3 miles of my home in Montgomery, Alabama. The second Costas hummingbird was banded within 5 miles of Fred Dietrich's home in Tallahassee, Florida. Now, if you're a thinking person, you might think that there's been a whole lot more of these around, but you've got to have somebody that sees the bird and knows what it is. So with all these birds, there are a lot more of them around than we're able to document. This is a magnificent hummingbird, and they've actually changed the name to Rivolis, but I think magnificent is a much better name. It's the second largest hummingbird in North America, and it's a two-toned hummingbird. It's got blue on the top of its head and green in its throat. And they're actually very dark green, but unless the bird's in the sunshine, it is so dark that it looks black. And that's one of the names. They're called the Black Knight. We've had one adult male in Alabama that came to a home in Monroeville, Alabama for 2 winters. There have been a couple of records in Georgia. This is one that spent the winter on an island off of the east coast of Georgia a few years ago. But to get some idea about the size of these birds, I get people quite often that tell me they have a really large hummingbird, and it's always been just a female black-chin when I get there. But look what a big hummingbird looks like. This is a few years ago in Louisiana. The bird on the right here is a Rufus Hummingbird, which is the same size as the ruby-throated. The bird on the left is an immature male magnificent or Rivolis hummingbird. Look at the size difference. Huge, huge birds. This is a white-eared hummingbird, another bird from Mexico in the desert southwest. There was one banded here in the mid-90s in Biloxi, Mississippi. And until about 3 years ago, we didn't get another one until I was in Mobile in November one day, and a good friend of mine called and said, "Have you heard about the white-eared hummingbird here in Mobile?" I didn't believe him for a while, but then I did, and I went over and was lucky enough to band an adult male white-eared hummingbird at a home in Mobile, Alabama. I may handle a lot of hummingbirds in my life, but I'll never handle one that was more beautiful than this one. What that tells you is that hummingbirds have wings. They don't read range maps, so any hummingbird can show up in any place. So just if you see a hummingbird, just because the book says it's not here, don't necessarily believe the book. This is a Mexican violet-eared hummingbird. If you have an older bird book, it's going to call it a green violet-eared hummingbird. It's all iridescent green with iridescent bluish purple through its eye. And this is a bird that can show up any time of the year. The last one that I know of was at a home in Bainbridge, Georgia for a couple hours just a few years ago. But these are what we call one-day wonders that just show up for a few hours and they're gone. This is one that Bob Sargent banded up in the mountains of western North Carolina a few years ago. And the only one here in the deep southeast that we banded was this bird in Bay Minette, Alabama, right on the Mississippi-Alabama border. This spent a couple of weeks at a home there. Just to show that you never know what you might get, a lady in Charlotte, North Carolina contacted one of our banders that she had a giant hummingbird coming to our feeder. This is what Susan found when she went over there. It was a green-breasted mango hummingbird, which is a tropical hummingbird. At that time, there were only 3 records in the United States, and they were all in the Brownsville area. So you never know what you might get. The fun thing about this bird was it was the first day of the year it was snowing, and the bird had never seen snowflakes, so it was trying to dodge the snow as it was flying around. About 3 years later, this one showed up in Dublin, Georgia, just east of Macon, and you can tell it's a young male by the dark streak down the center of its belly right there. But a beautiful, beautiful bird. Here it is in hand there. That day, and Bob Sargent had a large hand, that bird filled it. Now, one other bird that I always try to talk about, because I get reports of people that have these real small brown hummingbirds that are about half the size of their ruby-throated hummingbirds. Well, after asking a few questions, I can usually tell people that it's not a hummingbird. It's a Hummingbird moths. They're actually sphinx or clear wing moths, and there's about more than 50 different kinds of them, so they can look slightly different. But if you have a hummingbird that's only about half the size of your ruby-throated hummingbirds, and it doesn't come to a feeder, it's probably going to be a hummingbird moth. Now, they look a lot like a hummingbird, and I will never forget the first one I saw at my home in Montgomery. I knew I had a new species of hummingbird, so you were not going to be the first one to be fooled by that. But they unroll their proboscis and stick it out, and it looked exactly like a bill. They don't fly like a moth. They fly like a hummingbird there. They go to flowers, that sort of thing, but there's some tricks to it. They're usually at dawn or at dusk, and you won't see them at your feeder. But I get people that actually send me pictures of their hummingbirds to identify, and I usually have to tell them, I didn't know hummingbirds had antennae. So, you know, look at them very closely, and it might be a hummingbird moth. Now, very quickly, what it's like if a bander comes to your home. The first thing I'm going to do is pull a big wire cage out of the back of my truck, and you're going to think that old boy's been in the sunshine too long, because no hummingbird will ever go in that thing, but they will. I'm going to take that trap, put your feeder in it, and set it up on this audio-visual table that the legs go up and down, and I'm going to put it right back where it was, absolutely as close to where it was. It's a little hard to see here, but there's a door that slides up and down here, and I'm going to take this fishing reel with line and back off in your yard and pull on it, and that door is going to open. The bird will come up and go around. When it finds that door, it'll go into the feeder, at which time I let go of the line and the door closes behind it. It's not near as difficult as you might think it is. Then I'm going to take the bird to my office, which is also the tailgate of my pickup truck, to band it. If I haven't been to your home before, I'm going to take out a bottle of sugar water and let the bird feed. And people ask me, why do I feed a hummingbird like that? Well, it's only polite to give the hummingbird something to eat, but the main thing it does is calm the host down. When they see that hummingbird drinking in my hand like that, it becomes obvious this is not near as traumatic as they thought it was. Once I get the bird in my hand, they calm down completely. They're not bothered by it at all. No. Then we're going to band the bird. This is 100 hummingbird bands on a string. Hummingbird bands don't weigh anything. It takes about 5,500 of them to weigh an ounce. So they're not going to weight your bird down. It's not going to fly around with one leg down or around in circles or that sort of thing. Now the band has a letter and 5 numbers on it that I'm going to report to the National Bird Banding Lab with the information about your bird. So if that bird's ever encountered anywhere else, the person will report it to the National Bird Banding Laboratory. They will report it back to me, and I will let you know immediately if your bird has been caught anywhere else. As you can see, the bands are very, very tiny. Matter of fact, one of my jokes is with people, I tell, if you can read the number on this band, I'll let you band the next bird. But normally it's only me and little kids that can read the numbers. Now to get the band on the bird, I'm going to open it up by running it up a needle wide enough to go around the bird's leg. And then I take that band and put it in the hole in the end of these pliers. And it's a little hard to see with my big fat fingers here, but you put it around the bird's leg and close it down. When you close it, just close it back to a circle, so it's never tight on the bird's leg. It'll roll around and up and down, but it won't come over its foot. And it just gives that bird a name for the rest of its life. Then I do a series of measurements of the bird, its wing, its tail, its bill. Then I weigh the bird, and then I take a series of pictures of the bird. This is this past winter with an adult black-chinned hummingbird. When I finish my series of pictures of the bird, I take a picture of the host with their bird. Usually try to get a picture of their face because people might not believe them unless they see the hummingbird down their face. And then I'm going to ask you to hold your hand out, and I'm going to put the bird in your hand. Here's a Rufus Hummingbird in hand. And if you see the pink dot on some of these birds' head, that's just a bander's mark that tells me the bird's been bandaged, so you won't call me back for your bird again. It's not going to hurt the bird, and it wears off. Here's another Rufus and a Buff-Bellied Hummingbird in the Pensacola last year. And I tell people all the time, when I put that bird in your hand and you feel that heart rate, which is as high as 1,200 beats a minute, how warm it is, and it's looking up at you, you're going to be like this young lady in Idaho. You're going to be a happy camper, and you're going to want a winter hummingbird. Thank you very much.
Or stranger, any of the historic districts that we list.
That was awesome.
It was very good. Like I said, it took up pretty much where he left off on the first one, so that was good. It was interesting to see how they caged him. I was really wondering about that. In fact, I was going to ask you if you had any idea how they managed that. But
it usually happens really quickly. When he banded the Calliope at my house last winter, Fred arrived and we were just talking in the driveway, or Fred was getting out of the truck and just kind of starting conversation. And I had actually just seen the Calliope come back. So I told Fred, hey, we'll catch up, but something tells me you need to set the cage up right now, like get on it, because the Calliope would often come to the feeder and be done with its feeding there within 5 minutes, and I wouldn't see it again for another few hours. So he said he got busy, he set the cage up, and within 30 seconds it was trapped. He had the bird banded within 3 minutes of arriving at my house.
it's impressive. I guess you give credit to hummingbirds to be very brave, and I guess there's a good sign. The fact that they're willing to go right into a cage doesn't seem to bother them. All right, then I'll pass it on to Bubba, who's going to show us a video about how to use eBird for tracking hummingbirds. He did discuss that a bit in our first hummingbird session.
Yeah, I wanted to point out before you show, actually, I would love for you, do you have it queued up?
Yep.
Okay, you're going to be better at, you're going to be quicker at getting the share screen thing going than I. I do want to point out that one of the major benefits of the video is that, or the main reason that I did it is so that people had the ability to answer the question for themselves that so often comes up this time of year, or starting about, I would say, before most hummingbird migration has actually occurred in the eastern part of the United States, and that's, of course, for ruby-throateds. People start asking when they need to take their hummingbird feeders down, and it's just rampant in social media. And so, over the years, I'd promised myself I will set something up that uses eBird, and set it up as a tutorial so that people can actually go through the steps, no matter where they are in North America. And in fact, it doesn't even really matter that much where you are in the world, because you can use the same techniques to study any other species of bird. But I did it specifically in the context of the ruby-throated hummingbird in Alachua County, Florida. So it's of particular interest to us. But I do want you to watch this and then go back through it on your own and actually go through the process. I think most people here are already using eBird most of the time, but do be aware of the video, and I would love for you guys to share it when the questions come up in your various social media groups, for those of you who still do social media. So yeah, it's like 7 minutes long. What time we got now?
About 7:30.
Oh, good, 7:30. We have plenty of time, and then we'll have some time for some Q&A and still be done within an hour.
Yep. And so a reminder, if you have questions for Bubba, go ahead and put those in the chat, and then I'll pass those along to him after you watch the video.
Muting me.
And share.
Social media interest groups are inundated at various times of the season with questions about the status and distribution of a given bird species. In this case, the ruby-throated hummingbird. The questions are often about the timing of its migration and overwintering status, and are almost always easily answered using the bar chart feature in Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology's eBird.org Citizen Science Database interface. This tutorial is designed primarily to show you how to produce a line graph for whichever species of bird you wish to investigate, and for any region or location. We're going to make the point using the ruby-throated hummingbird in Alachua County, Florida, because the ruby-throated hummingbird is in the peak of fall migration right now, and because I use these line graphs while having status and distribution conversations with customers in Wild Birds Unlimited every day, and I know that there is no other learning tool quite like eBird to broaden understanding about the birds in your own backyard. First, point your web browser to ebird.org, that's ebird.org, and click Explore on the navigation bar near the top of the page. Then click bar charts from the options below. Now you will have to choose a location. For most of us, United States will be pre-populated in the first flyout window. I'm going to scroll down until I find Florida. When I click Florida, a few options will open up to the right, including counties in Florida. Select the radio button Counties in Florida and then Continue at the bottom of the page. I'm going to choose Alachua and click Continue. Note that you can choose up to 15 counties from which to pull data for your chart. This is particularly helpful if you are in a county where there is not enough data to produce smooth line graphs that aren't ragged looking, but because Alachua County is data rich, I am only going to select Alachua County and click Continue. The result is a list of all the species of bird ever recorded in Alachua County and an accompanying bar chart for each, graphically demonstrating abundance in each month for a year. You can either scroll down to ruby-throated hummingbird or use the Windows search shortcut Control F and enter a keyword like hummingbird. Press Enter and Windows will take you right to the first result. Results are grouped phylogenetically, so spend some time in the bar charts familiarizing yourself with other hummingbird species that are on the list that you just produced. Note that not all hummingbird species have the word hummingbird in their name, so depending on the area for which you are producing charts, it might take a little more investigation to get it all sorted. In Alachua County, Florida, however, there have been 6 species of hummingbird recorded, and each of them does have the word hummingbird in its name. As an extreme example to the contrary, Colombia has just over 150 species of hummingbird, but only 25 or so have the word hummingbird in their name. Next, click on the line graph icon to the right of ruby-throated hummingbird and to the left of the bar chart, and the result will be the annual historical frequency line graph for ruby-throated hummingbird in Alachua County. Now you can begin to investigate the status and distribution of the ruby-throated hummingbird over the course of an entire year. I have interpreted various points of interest for this entire graph on our store website, but in the interest of time and because of the effect that subtropical storms have on the status and distribution of birds during migration, I want to bring your attention to the little shoulder on this line graph corresponding to the first 2 weeks in September. This little hitch in the data is an increase to the average frequency caused by spikes within a season when subtropical storms cause a bottleneck in migration as birds stack up in the peninsula. To see one of these spikes within a season, click on Change Date in the Date Range Attributes section near the top of the page. For a particularly active storm season with a large associated bottleneck in migration, change the range of years to include 2017 only, when Hurricanes Irma, Maria, and Nate all affected migration in the Antilles and the Gulf of Mexico. The large spike in early September is attributable mainly to Hurricane Irma. The small spike in early October is attributable mainly to Hurricane Nate, with Maria affecting most of those dates in between. I will reset the date range to represent all of the data, and then we'll move over to the Change Species button, also near the top of the page, to demonstrate one final point about the value of these line graphs in understanding the status and distribution of hummingbirds in Alachua County, Florida. Do you recall from the total list of avifauna for Alachua County that there were 5 other species of hummingbird which have been recorded here? With this feature, we can see line graph data for a maximum of 5 species. I will now add 3 of those 5 species to the graph of ruby-throated hummingbirds so that we can compare status and distribution of multiple species in the same graph. Those species are Rufus Hummingbird, Black-chinned Hummingbird, and Calliope Hummingbird. I have chosen to omit Allen's Hummingbird because it has only occurred once in the county, and Buff-Bellied Hummingbird because it has only occurred twice in the county. Calliope Hummingbird has only been recorded in the county 4 times, but 3 of those 4 instances involved a great many individual reports from dozens and dozens of birders. To put a final touch on bringing the significance of this multi-species graph to light, I will now open the date range feature back up and adjust the dates to include only those data in the time of year considered to be outside of the migration season and breeding season, namely November through February. And when I do, eBird rescales the values on the y-axis since the frequency of ruby-throated hummingbird observations is no longer flattening the data of the other species towards the x-axis. And now you are able to literally see the reasons that hummingbird experts tell you that it is never time to put your hummingbird feeder away. The frequency varies from season to season, and the total number of species varies from winter to winter, but there are always birds to see, at least in Alachua County. Now you know exactly how to determine the degree to which that is true for you, no matter where you live. If you happen to be in a place where there is never any species of hummingbird, you can still have some fun investigating eBird.
That's it.
Yeah, that was very, very well done. I don't know how much eBird pays for videos, but I think you could have a career there if you could figure out how to get money out of it.
Yeah, that'd be nice. I'm not making any anymore. Money, that is. I'll make tutorials.
Yeah, that was excellent. I'll definitely go back and watch that again. I posted the link to that YouTube video in the chat. And again, don't forget to post your questions there. Bubba's got time now to answer those questions.
Hey, while people are thinking of questions, if they have any, I wanted to put Doug Gilmore on the spot. He's the new owner. There he is. Hey, Doug. Doug's a new owner of Wild Birds Unlimited, along with Lindsay, his daughter, and Susan, his wife. And they're rocking and rolling. I just dropped by there today.
Yep, thanks very much. We're very excited to be here in Gainesville, and it's amazing how the birding community is so large here in Gainesville, and the interest in the environment and nature. It's wonderful to be taking over the legacy that Bubba and Ingrid have built over the last 19 years and continue that. And hopefully, I said to Bubba a few weeks ago, right now, I'd say my knowledge of birds is about 1% of his. And I hope that in a few years, maybe I'll get up to 5%.
How are your video production skills?
Nowhere near what his are. I'm good in PowerPoint. I spent 20, 30 years in the corporate world. I can do a lot of PowerPoints, but that's some slick stuff.
That's good. All right, come on, people questions. I actually had written down a few questions, and Bubba hit those pretty good during this presentation, so I ran out of questions. And I was going to ask about the caging, but that was also answered and addressed. So.
Yeah. You know, I did make some notes while I was listening to Fred's presentation. He talked about that dead time in between ruby-throated migration and the onset of the overwintering phase. We're in that time right now. And so I find that to be particularly challenging, since I know it's difficult for me to continue to put new nectar in the feeder, but I do it knowing that last year the things didn't really get hot until December. And then all of a sudden I had, between me and my neighbor, we had 4 hummingbirds, including a Calliope, or 2 Rufus and a ruby-throated. So if I had given up in between the end of ruby-throated hummingbird migration and the onset of the overwintering phase, then that would have been a sad thing. Although I did also want to mention that, Fred says you will not, he says, guarantees you will not see hummingbird if you don't have a feeder out in the wintertime. And I do leave a feeder out, but last winter, there were times when the only place I was seeing my hummingbirds was at the fire spike. Now, it just so happens that every time that the temperature threatens to freeze, I take a big old thick plastic tarp and I pull it over my fire spike, and then I run a heat lamp underneath it. I cover the heat lamp in an old metal milk crate so that it doesn't catch a fire spike on fire. And that keeps my fire spike really happy all winter long. Also, there's a lot to be said about some nuance that occurs in the Florida Peninsula with regard to what we tend to see in the Panhandle being quite different from what we tend to see from about just south of Marion County on down to the tip of the state in the peninsula. The ruby-throated hummingbird is the most common annually from about Marion County south. In Alachua County, the Rufus hummingbird is usually the most common overwintering species, but that does fluctuate more with the ruby-throated, and there are some winters when ruby-throated is far more common than the Rufus hummingbird, but those are winters when there's relatively little Rufus activity. Ruby-throated is usually pretty consistent. Up in the Panhandle, from Alabama all the way across to Jacksonville, the Rufus hummingbird is definitely consistently the most common overwintering species. When Fred was talking about the Rufus being followed by the black-chinned, being followed by the ruby-throated, and then all those other species, that was generalizing for the entire Southeast.
I get Rufuses pretty consistently, females. I don't think I've ever had a male in my feeders. And Rex Rowan's always given me kickback as to whether or not it's actually an Allen's hummingbird.
Yeah.
So it's I don't get credit very frequently for seeing female Rufuses.
Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. We do use status and distribution to aid our identifications, and that is a really good thing. One of the major differences between beginners and intermediate birders is that beginners a lot of times are not using status and distribution, or they haven't studied status and distribution enough to help them rule things out. So, you get, for instance, people reporting purple finch all the time when we know they're seeing a house. Well, we don't know they're seeing a house finch, but we strongly suspect they're seeing a house finch, especially if it's not in the wintertime, that this purple finch is being reported. And even in the wintertime, except for 2020 and early 2021, purple finch, we would only get a handful maybe each winter. Last year was an anomaly. Black-capped chickadee is another example. People reporting black-capped chickadees all the time when we know they're seeing Carolina chickadees, or perhaps more to their credit, hairy woodpecker instead of downy. Status and distribution alone tells us, no, this is almost certainly a downy woodpecker. Of course, there are hairy woodpeckers in the county, and they do have wings and they fly around, but they just don't show up in urban or suburban yards at feeders. That being said, what was the point I was going to make about status and distribution? We maybe take that to the other extreme when we're reporting a Rufus Hummingbird, knowing that status and distribution alone tells us that it almost certainly is a Rufus Hummingbird. We actually, in most cases, don't really know. And so intermediate and expert birders or beginners who know a little bit more about hummingbirds will perhaps be erroneously reporting, or not perhaps, but certainly are making assumptions when they report a Rufus Hummingbird, knowing that it probably is, but not knowing for sure that it is.
Yeah, I was definitely operating under the probably a Rufus Hummingbird assumption, and Rex, to his credit, is holding that line. All right, we have a question here from Sally Larson. When the temperature dips below freezing, what do you do with your hummingbird feeders? I mean, obviously it doesn't happen too frequently here, but it's inevitable.
You mean because the nectar might freeze?
Because of the freezing temperatures, yeah.
You know, in nearly 20 years of extensive experience with this, that's not a problem that I had to develop a a common response for. I know that some people put heat lamps there. If you're concerned about the nectar freezing and you want to make sure that in the morning, if it's gotten cold enough to freeze sugary water, then I would say we need to look into whether or not a heat lamp is a good idea. I think that inserting a heating element, or actually putting a heating pad, that you bungee cord essentially to your feeder, is something that people do. Putting a heating element inside of the nectar is probably overkill and might actually be dangerous. But here in Florida, I've never, in 20 plus years of experience with this, I don't think I've ever recalled a morning where I've woken up and found my feeders frozen solid.
Yeah, I think that's certainly more of an issue in some of those pictures that Fred showed us with the snow piled up on top of the feeder.
I would, Nancy Newfield's group in New Orleans is going to have a lot more experience with that, because New Orleans gets far more freezing nights than we do. And those people, Nancy Newfield was the one she was the bander who broke the seal on this overwintering phenomenon by with her banding network around New Orleans. Around New Orleans. Nice thing about New Orleans too is that a lot of the overwintering movement that we benefit from are further in the Southeast is occurring because after migration, or after a good portion of migration for a number of species, there is a bit of a kind of like an apparent backflow phenomenon where ruby-throated is especially it will show up more and more throughout the winter. And as Fred said, January and February being the hottest months, not literally hottest months, but hottest months in terms of frequency of sightings of these birds, because over the course of the winter, it's likely that they're actually moving back up from overwintering grounds in Mexico and following the contour of the Gulf along until they finally reach the panhandle of Florida or the Atlantic coast, even in some cases.
You might find it interesting. This is Doug here. I just Googled it, and the freezing point of a 25% sugar water is 29 degrees, not 32 degrees. So again, as somebody just mentioned, it does get its freezing point is lower, so it's going to stay as regular water for a lower temperature.
Right. You also have quite a bit of mass of water in a feeder as well. So. Well,
I know it's probably still not a sufficient answer for Sally, and I apologize for that. We just don't have to deal with it very often.
Yeah,
I would pose that to Nancy Newfield and see all the little contraptions that people make. I definitely have seen people taking hummingbird feeders and resting them on top of heating pads, or wrapping heating pads to the bottom of feeders with some sort of cord.
Mm-hmm.
Tina had a Rufus Hummingbird for 5 years, shared it with Ron Robinson. The last time I saw it and took a picture in hand, keeps jumping around, and sent it to Fred. He said it was the 6th year per Fred. That was 2 years ago. She misses it. I think I knew the cage.
She says the hummingbird
Oh.
started recognizing the cage. It was being caught so
Oh,
frequently.
it knew the cage. This is what I get for trying to read without.
That's all right. I
putting
should
my
have
reading
jumped
glasses
in.
back
I should
on.
have jumped in and read it for you.
Sally's happy with that discussion. Cool. Good.
Felicia's got a question. Curious to know if any particular weather patterns contribute to wintering hummingbird populations around here. I mean, are we better off in warmer weather or warmer winter, or does it matter? Colder, does colder weather up north force them further south, or vice versa?
Well, I think once your hummingbirds are settling down extraliminally, or more further north than is considered to be normal for their wintering range, they probably are behaving more facultatively than and moving according to what their faculties are demanding. And so this is me just kind of thinking through it, but I don't have any evidence or any good evidence that birds are moving back to the north because of things that are happening in their normal wintering range. Like, does some sort of weather pattern in Mexico, for instance, cause Rufus or ruby-throated hummingbirds to move back to the north, or is it just something they do anyway? I do think about these things all the time. I was just thinking about today why Tim Harden has 3 Tennessee warblers coming to his bird bath, and why we can see 3, 4, 5 of them in my yard yesterday, and this has been going on for a couple weeks. Of course, we are in last week of October and November are the peak of their movement, and we are in the normal range. So why do some years you get so many Western tanagers, and other years you get 1 or 2 over the course of a winter? So I think that it's that question can be considered, or should be applied to the aspiring experts thinking about every species of bird. Is that a really cheesy way to not answer your question?
That was good. All right, that's it for questions. I think what I'll do at this point, I often think that I shut this down a little too early, but I'm going to go ahead and end the formal portion of this and stop recording. And so it's officially over, but